What's up everyone, Kriddle here, and I recently made a solo tier list for Monster and Memories, and I had several questions regarding duos, trios, small group compositions, and even some questions regarding larger group compositions and how I would do those. So I figured I would hopefully make a quick video going over the different roles and the different classes and what they bring to a party. This is not going to be an exhaustive list by any means, but hopefully give you an idea of how to build parties in Monsters and Memories, because it's a little bit different than your standard MMOs today. So the first thing that I would bring to any party is going to be a dedicated healer. You need this because something like a World of Warcraft, let's say you're coming from that game, you can usually just sit down, drink some water, eat some food, replenish your health and mana, and then go to the next fight, and then rinse and repeat and continue to do that. In this game, getting your health and mana back up takes a long time. Like, you have to sit down and just wait, and there's nothing you can really do to speed that up. You're going to need to have a dedicated healer. What this will allow you to do is this dedicated healer can then sit down and meditate, gaining their mana back while everyone else in the party is fighting. And then when they need to, they will heal, and then they'll sit back down and gain their mana back to be able to continue to heal. So the three different healers that are in the game, we have the cleric, the druid, and the shaman. So I'm going to go over quickly what each one of these brings to a party. The cleric is going to be your most efficient healer in the game, but it has the least amount of utility. The only thing that it really brings utility-wise is it does have a resurrection ability, which will recover some of the lost XP. When you die in Monsters and Memories, you will lose experience, and this will get up to 95% of that experience back at higher levels with the cleric. So that's one of the big utilities that a cleric brings, and you will most likely die at some point in this game. It's just kind of inevitable. The next thing that it brings is going to be a stun. It is the only of the three healers that has the ability to stun enemies to prevent them from casting spells, run away, like if they're trying to heal themselves, those kind of things. It will stop those from happening. It can be very beneficial, and it also helps just to reduce the amount of damage that whoever you have tanking is taking. So that's the second benefit of the cleric. The third is going to be they have a lull ability, which will allow them to break up camps. So if you have three different enemies in a camp, you can cast lull on all three of those different enemies, and then you can pull one of them individually. So it allows you to not pull an entire camp of 3 or 4 or 5 different enemies, because that would be devastating to a smaller group. Like if you have a duo or trio and you don't have a way to crowd control, most likely you pull 3 enemies. It's not going to go very well for you. So that's the cleric. Next up, we have the druid. The druid's going to bring a lot more utility, and it's going to have things like a damage shield. So every time that your tank or whoever is taking the damage for your party, every time they take damage in melee from the enemy, they're going to do damage back to the enemy. Next up, they have Speed of the Wild, which is a run speed buff that allows you to get away. It also helps you with pulling. So if you go and you pull an enemy and you're trying to run back to the camp, instead of it beating on you all the way back to the camp, you can kind of get back to the camp first, and then the enemy will come later. Also, if you pull too many enemies, you can run away and get to a zone line so that you don't die. So very beneficial there. It also has a melee strength buff. So you have multiple melee classes in your party, then it can increase the amount of damage that all of them are doing, which is very nice. It has a pet starting at level 32, which is going to add a little bit of damage, not too much, but every little bit counts. It does have dots. They're not the best dots in the game, but it does have some dots. So it allows them to cast a dot and then sit back down and meditate while they're waiting. Dots are very nice to have when you have a duo or trio. When you start getting into 4, 5, or 6 players in your party, dots are not nearly as beneficial because enemies do die very quickly in this. They don't have nearly enough health for dots to be beneficial. But with a small like duo or trio, 1 or 2 dots can definitely help out in the kill speed. They also have a snare ability, which prevents enemies from running away and getting more mobs. So if you're in a small congested area with a lot of enemies around you, and the enemy gets down to, let's say, 25% health, and they start to run, they can run fairly quickly at times, especially if they have Speed of the Wild cast on them, and they can run into more enemies. So very beneficial to have a snare, and it's the only one of the 3 healers that has the snare ability. Lastly, it has Unity, which is basically the same thing as the lull ability we were talking about with the cleric, but it's an area effect spell. So you cast it on one and it spreads to the others. So you can cast one Unity spell and then pull one enemy out of that group. Lastly, we have the Shaman. The Shaman's going to have better buffs than the Druid. So the Druid has the Strength buff. The Shaman has a Strength, Dexterity, Agility, Stamina buff, all built into one. So it's going to be really nice to have for any of your melee classes that are doing some damage. It's going to allow them to hit more often and do a little bit more damage. And it's going to give your tank more agility and stamina to allow them to tank a little bit better. They also have a haste ability, which is going to increase the attack speed of your melee classes by up to like 60%, I think, at the high end. So that could effectively increase your group DPS by 60%, especially if you have a very melee auto attack heavy group. Things like the rogue or the monk or the fighter, very auto attack heavy, and it would help out quite a bit with that. They also are the only of the 3 healers that have a purge ability. The purge is going to remove buffs off of your enemy. So if they have something like Speed of the Wild cast on them or a damage shield, the Shaman can then remove that buff, which really helps out if you have a melee heavy group, especially when you have a hasted melee heavy group and they're constantly hitting an enemy with a damage shield. They're just going to be taking a lot of damage themselves, and the Shaman will be able to purge that buff. They also get a slow, which will slow the attack speed of the enemy down quite a bit. It's actually the best slow in the game. I think it's up to like 60 or 70% at the high end. They do get a pet at level 32, just like the Druid does. Every little bit of damage helps with that. And then they do have the second best dots in the game. So if you have a smaller group, duo or trio, having those dots can definitely be beneficial. And the last thing they also have that the Druid has is Speed of the Wild to allow you to run a bit faster. Next up, you're going to need somebody to be able to take the hits, and that's going to be your tank class. And I'm actually grouping in the monk with these. So you have the different tanks. We have the monk, the fighter, the inquisitor, the paladin, and the shadow knight. Any of these are nice to have. I personally would go with, if I was going to do a duo or a trio, with the monk or the fighter, and I would probably put those with the druid or the shaman. Your best bet is probably going to be shaman with one of these two as a duo. It is by far the best duo in the game, in my opinion, because you're going to be able to consistently do pulls, and you're going to have the heals that you need. You're going to have the buffs that you need. You pretty much have everything that you need between those two. The only thing that you'll be missing is the unity from one of these two. So you won't be able to break up spawns as easily. But usually if you have, a good camp or something, once you break the camp, this is an amazing duo for any situation. So the monk is going to be able to take decent amount of hits. It's not the best tank. It's the worst out of the 5 different tanks in this group setup that I have here. But it's going to be able to do a decent amount of damage. It has stuns. It has interrupts to prevent enemies from casting spells, things of that nature. So it's got some utility, but not a lot of utility. It also has the way to break up camps. Like I was saying, if you go with a shaman, you can actually break up camps with the monk because you're able to use feign death. So you can pull 3 or 4 mobs, feign death, let some of them walk away. When there's one left, you pull that one and you can break up pulls that way. So a monk with a shaman is one of the best duos in the game because it pretty much has everything that you need. The only thing that would be missing would be a snare ability of some sort if the enemy decides to run. So you'd have to be kind of careful for that. With the fighter, again, not a lot of utility. It does have a stun and it does have an interrupt, so it can stop enemies from casting spells. But other than that, it doesn't have a whole lot. These two, however, are going to be 2 of your better DPS when compared to the other 3 classes over here. The Inquisitor kind of being in the middle, but these are going to be better DPS, especially if you pair them with the shaman and have the haste, because these are very auto attack heavy classes. So the shaman, again, is going to just benefit both of those quite a bit. Moving on to the Inquisitor, this is going to allow you to break up a spawn. If you accidentally pull 3 or 4 mobs, they are going to be able to mesmerize the different mobs. They also have an ability that allows them to charm, and then they can also interrupt and drain mana, things like that from the enemies. So it's very nice to have. I think they can also purge. So if you don't have a shaman, and let's say you go with the druid with the Inquisitor will be able to purge those abilities that the druid or the cleric will not be able to purge. The Paladin over here has more stuns. It also has a AC buff, and then it has abilities to heal itself, which frees up some mana for the Druid or the Shaman to be able to cast things like dots or debuffs. So the Paladin could be nice, but do note that if you go with any of these classes over here, they do have mana, so they will have a little bit more downtime. The Shadow Knight is going to have things like some dots, and then also it's going to have a snare ability. So if you go with a Cleric or a Shaman and you don't have the snare of the Druid, the Shadow Knight will be able to snare the mobs so that they don't run away and get into some other mobs, and you end up getting in a situation that you can't handle. So I would say overall, I would go with the Druid or the Shaman with the Monk or the Fighter as a duo or even a trio. But once you start getting into some larger groups, adding in these other classes for different utility can be very beneficial. At this point, I would start adding in DPS. So you have your healers able to keep your party alive. They're meditating while the rest of your party is fighting. You have your tank that's able to take the hits and keep the aggro off of the other party members that can't take the hits. At this point, you want to just add more damage so that you are eliminating enemies as fast as possible to gain XP as fast as possible. In my opinion, the two best classes for that are going to be the Archer and the Rogue. The reason for that, again, just like the tank classes, is because neither of these use mana, so they can consistently do damage very easily. Doesn't matter how many mobs you pull, you can just always, they're able to do damage. They don't have to sit down, they don't have to meditate, any of that, especially if you're going to have a Shaman in your party with haste. Let's say you have a Shaman with your Fighter, and then you add a Rogue, and the Shaman is just going to add haste to that Rogue and the Fighter, just increasing the amount of damage that they do, and it's just going to be a net gain for your party up to the trio amount. So that would be the next thing that I would say, but any of the DPS classes at this point are good. I would say that a melee DPS is probably going to be best, so one of these two. The next would be the Ranger, and then after that, I would say probably the Spellblade, and then one of the pet classes. The Wizard is one that I would usually leave out for later, and I would do that after you have a Bard or an Enchanter in your party, and we'll go over that in just a second. But after that, I would say adding in one of the pet classes or the Ranger for more melee DPS is going to be your best bet. So now that we have our healer, our tank, and our DPS, this is pretty much the best setup, in my opinion, for a trio group. And it doesn't matter which one of these you choose, just make sure that you mix and match them properly so that you get as much utility as possible. And what I mean by that is, take the Druid, for example. You don't necessarily need to go with a Shadow Knight because the Shadow Knight's going to bring a snare, but the Druid already has a snare. If you go with the Shaman, then you're probably going to want to bring something like the Monk or the Inquisitor for the to break up the spawn or to mesmerize mobs, because you're not going to have the unity or lull from the Cleric or the Druid. So just make sure that you're getting as much utility as possible from these three. But once you start getting into the 4th, 5th, 6th members of your party, you're going to start adding more utility. So it doesn't really matter which one of these that you have, as long as you have a healer, a tank, and I would say the melee DPS. And then from this point, you're going to want to add in a Bard or an Enchanter, and that's just going to benefit everybody in your party and anybody that you add to your party going forward. So the Bard and the Enchanter are going to bring things like haste if you don't already have haste from the Shaman. They're also going to give you a better haste. They also do have some melee DPS buffs like strength, I believe dexterity, that they can bring, which are, I think, equal to or pretty close to that of a Shaman. So especially if you have a Druid or Cleric, you're going to want to bring in one of these two. And then finally, they're going to bring in mana regen. So maybe with your healer was only able to heal and wasn't able to add things like dots or debuffs. With that mana regen that either one of these classes bring, it's going to allow them to now start to add in some dots or debuffs to make fights a little bit easier. So now that we have our perfect party of 4, the only thing we really need to do is add in more DPS, and any of these classes over here are going to add in more DPS, especially if you add in melee classes with your now that you have the haste buffs, you have mana regen, so any of these will not have too much of a mana issue, so any of those will work for that. Now, what you do want to look for are things that you might be missing. So find out what you have in your party of 4 here. Let's say that you didn't go with the Druid. Now you need a snare ability because you don't have the Druid or the Shadow Knight in there, and nobody else has a snare. So you might want to add in the Ranger or the Necromancer, which are going to add in snares. The Ranger also could add in Speed of the Wild, which might be missing from the Shaman buffs. And speaking of Shaman buffs, you might want to add in the Beastmaster, which is going to add in some of those melee Shaman buffs that you might be missing. The Elementalist here is probably my favorite class to add for this 5th spot. The reason for that is because the pets have a variety of different abilities. The air pet is going to allow your melee classes to double attack more often with their main hand. They also have a water pet that's going to give mana regen. Let's say if you went with some of these tanks up here that use a lot of mana and they're constantly having to stand up and they can't sit down, this could be a very beneficial class to have to get them a little bit more mana. Wizard is going to bring more damage than any of the other classes that are left. It also does have a snare and an AoE purge. So if you didn't go with the Shaman, which has a purge, or the Inquisitor, I believe that has a purge, and the Archer, if you didn't have one of those 3 in your party to purge enemies, then a Wizard is definitely one that you would want to grab. And then finally, we have the Spellblade here, which is going to be a melee spellcaster kind of mixture and is good for pretty much any party for some added DPS. So anyway, that is how I would build my group setups, starting from duos all the way up to a full party. Hopefully this video helps. If it does, please like, subscribe, follow, and be sure to check us out over on Twitch, where I play and stream Monsters of Memory as well as many other games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.